Welcome to Coffee with Coker, a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape. I'm your host, Mark Reibolt. I'm a senior vice president at Coker. Today's episode is a little bit different from our typical podcast. This is actually a recording of a live webinar that we did recently. It was a really popular topic and I thought a very productive discussion. So we wanted to release this out to all of our subscribers and audience. The webinar consisted of a couple of guests, and we were talking specifically about kind of an update on MACRA, but 1 month into MACRA, as many of the changes have taken effect in January 2019 as this is being recorded and released. And so joining me on the webinar was Roz Cordini, who's our Senior Vice President of Compliance Services, Brandt Jewell, who is Senior Vice President of Physician Services, and Alex Kirkland, who is a Vice President in our Financial Advisory Services group. And again, this was a great discussion. We talked about a lot of different things that relates to MACRA. We kind of got an update, brought up to speed on where we are with MACRA, talking about some of the new legislation or the new policies that are going into effect or have gone into effect as of the beginning of 2019. And then some of the things to look for as far as preparing for what's coming down the pipe on MACRA this year, as well as looking into the future and what we can expect. And so I thought there were some great tips, kind of perspectives on what's happening as it relates to MACRA and some other similar policies coming out of Washington. So we also had a chance to answer a couple of questions, and I know we got additional questions subsequently, so perhaps we'll do a follow-up episode and answer some of those or continue the discussion that we had for the webinar. But again, we thank you all for listening. We encourage, as always, our listeners to check on our website. You can go to coffeewithcoker.com, and there you can find all of our past episodes of the podcast, including this one. And you can also submit any questions you have or if there's suggestions for topics you'd like us to cover in the future. Again, that's coffeewithcoker.com. And you can find us on social media as well, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and the main company website at cokergroup.com. So we encourage you all to reach out to us. We hope you enjoy this discussion 1 month into MACRA. Thank you for listening. Welcome to Coffee with Coker. This is the live webinar edition, and we want to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Mark Reibolt, and I'm the moderator for today's panel discussion. And joining me for the webinar, we have 3 Coker team members, and we are talking about MACRA, specifically 1 month in for 2019. So joining me today is Roz Cordini. She's a Senior Vice President of Compliance Services, Brandt Jewell, who's Senior Vice President of Physician Services, and Alex Kirkland, who's Vice President in our Financial Services group. Today we're going to be talking about a number of things related to MACRA now that we are officially in 2019, 1 month in, and we'll be addressing some questions. And at the end of the webinar, so as just a reminder, the phone lines are muted, but you can submit questions via the webinar dashboard or panel, and you can submit questions that way, and we'd love to answer those at the end of the presentation. Also, the slides that we're using are going to be made available as a handout, so you can download those directly on the GoToWebinar dashboard. They'll also be made available on the Coker website, Coffee with Coker website, subsequently. So again, we want to make sure this information is helpful for you all, and also if you have any questions, we definitely want to get to those. So what we're going to be talking about today, we have a number of things related to MACRA, and Alex and Brandt and Roz are going to be covering a few slides and a couple of different topics on the agenda. So we're going to start out talking about just an update and where we're at as far as volume to value, where we've come from and where that brings us up to today, where Brandt's going to then talk about the 2019 Medicare physician fee schedule changes. And we thought that would be relevant to point out, just since there have been so many different things to go into effect, and a number of different changes that are definitely going to impact how hospitals, health systems, medical groups work within a MACRA paradigm. And then we want to talk about, okay, what does this mean for your practice, your health systems practices, and how ultimately you should be thinking about preparing for the impact of MACRA going forward. And then finally, we want to make sure we address what role compliance plays in this new realm of MACRA. And so Roz is going to address that. But just to bring us up to speed, let's dive right in. And Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can give us an update on volume to value.
Thanks, Mark. We wanted to have this conversation right now. We're talking about 1 month into MACRA, because January of 2019, the month we're in, is the first time that we are experiencing these payment changes from the MIPS payment adjustments, one of the two payment tracks within MACRA. And that's so important because this is signifying that first wholesale step towards value-based reimbursement. We are now seeing those wholesale changes and how that's changing our world. And I thought it would be relevant if we could kind of back up and discuss how we kind of got here. And so from our volume to value, we have seen this paradigm shift within the industry, where there will continue, and I think about this paradigm shift within three different segments. There will continue to be focus to incentivize providers to coordinate care across care settings, and now they have to be aware of the cost to the patient. Those are incentives within MACRA and other payment models being developed. The manner in which patients are seeking to consume care will also continue to evolve. We're in the information age where data is being used to streamline decisions, to drive more services towards a commodity-like approach. That's just another factor that we have to consider within this value-based world. Also, the payers are continuing to develop new models that shift risk onto the providers. And they're going to share more and more data with us, but we have to understand what to do with that so that we can react accordingly. And if we go into the next model, or the next slide, we're going to talk about some of these changing payment models. So these are really shifting our economics. And this is just an illustration that kind of depicts that, from fee-for-service to global-based payments, and the spectrum in between. What are all of the manners in which the payers are trying to develop models to shift risk onto the providers, essentially? I think the key concept to understand and take away from this is that our revenue streams are shifting, and we have to replace those revenue streams with new ones coming in the door. And the ones that will always be there will always have some element of fee-for-service revenue come in the door, but that's being augmented to an extent as well, where now MACRA and these other value-based initiatives are tying some level of value-based component to that. And so we want to be cognizant of that. As those revenues are now coming in the door, how do we align incentives towards that so that we can be proportionate with the revenues coming in the door to the way that we're trying to incentivize our provider behavior?
And Alex, I think one of the important things about this shift is we've seen experimental programs and some official programs that still were experimental in nature to try to find the right balance of quality, cost, and outcomes. And I think the recent implementation of the MIPS changes and QPP reporting is formalizing some of that in what appears to be a sustainable model that is tied heavily on the fee-for-service side, but is a broader reaching quality program that's more easily administered across the provider landscape. And it's opening up this world that was formerly reserved for progressive organizations who wanted to be a pioneer ACO, or who had the capacity to manage bundled payments or contract directly with employers around shared savings or things like that. Now this is expanding through CMS in a formal way to providers who haven't been able to participate in that before. And we're still in a phase here where there's upside to be had, as opposed to that bottom layer of your chart here that where global payments have a significant amount of risk for those same providers. So it's an interesting time to be thinking through this, particularly given the size of practices or groups and how they're positioned within their markets.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's just a giant game of who moved my cheese that we all have to play, right? And we're within these new models that are not going to go anywhere, which kind of takes us into our next point as far as what the payer goals may be. How are we going to see this new shift towards risk continue? And we see that the payers, driven by healthcare reform, are continuing to push more risk onto providers. And MACRA is the example for how fee-for-service is being adjusted. In fact, there was a goal in place where 90% of all Medicare fee-for-service payments had to have some form of quality or value attached to it by the end of 2018. Now, that was an Obama-era administration goal. And so, naturally, the question becomes, well, under the Trump administration, or does it even matter what administration it is, how will politics impact the push towards value-based care? And what we're seeing is that payment reform, not coverage reform, but payment reform is really a bipartisan issue. Both sides acknowledge that we have to do something to curb the cost bend, the cost curve. And so, even with key administrators in the Trump administration, Alex Azar and Seema Verma, both have come out with a continued push towards value-based programs. And it's not just, CMS kind of sets the tone, but it's not just CMS that we're having to play the rules by. Other payers are setting up similar programs as well. And so we have commercial ACOs that we can elect to join into now. And there's consortiums that have been pulled together, like the Healthcare Transformation Task Force, that have put out their own goals of having, their membership tied all of their revenue streams towards risk-based models by 2020. And so we are going to continue to see this push towards value-based models, risk-based models. It's not just the government driving this, but they are, and we'll kind of now talk about our transition towards value, because it is the government that kind of set the tone on that. We needed that impetus that MACRA is driving, that wholesale change to push us down this value-based path. And we've seen different structures and models that were put in place that are now taking that form. Now in January 2019, we are experiencing these payment adjustments. And then a question that comes to mind is, well, how is this impacting us? How many people our providers are impacted by this? And surprising to many, that participation exceeded projections from when MACRA first rolled out. The MIPS program, there was more participation in 2017 than was initially thought there would be. Now, part of that is because the government eased us into this program and made it ease regulations to promote adoption. But regulations will stiffen, and more of our fee-for-service revenue will be subject to increased quality and cost standards. Another reason why participation exceeded projections is because of how serious providers are taking this. It's no longer water cooler talk. I think this is now becoming a real part of our lives, that we have to adhere to the rules and regulations that are being thought of, and we're reacting accordingly, because it's shifting the economics that we're involved with, so that we can try to adapt. Maybe like a good way to conclude on this shift from volume to value, and how we're now in the throes of it, is to kind of recap some of the outcomes we saw from the 2017 performance year, which is having an impact on our 2019 payment adjustments. What we did in 17 determined what level of payment adjustment we are now receiving starting this month in January 19. And what we saw is that there were over 1 million clinicians that participated in the Quality Payment Program, which was the MIPS and APM payment tracks that MACRA established. we're seeing more clinicians participate in the alternative payment model track as well. And not only are we seeing a good number of participation, exceeding those initial projections, we saw also pretty high scores right off the bat. And you can see that the mean score for MIPS eligible physicians was over 74 points on a scale of 100, the median being 83. Now, most of those, or we do see small and rural practice coming in with scores beneath that because they may not have the administrative support of an employed practice or a larger independent physician association. But it's important to note that there's are pathways and avenues that those small and rural practices should take advantage of in order to make sure that they're able to maximize their scores.
Hey, Alex. One question there on the rural and small practices. Is there any potential correlation there to maybe the ability to record, track, and measure, and ultimately report on data? Meaning maybe the technology systems aren't up to par, or the technical efficiency.
That's a great point, because those small and rural practices, are not able to make the level of investment that a larger employed health system can make. And so much of this is that we have to, we could have the best physicians in the world, but CMS has to know that through the data that we share them. They have to be able to score and calculate different metrics.
Right.
And we're dependent on these technology systems to get the information to CMS.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just think that's such an important point there that I don't know that we can. I don't want to signal that the quality was necessarily lower. It's just what the data that's being reported on, and I think it says something about the burden of this on provider organizations, because they do have to have the technological capability and infrastructure in order just to, get up to kind of a level of being able to report baseline and then obviously build on that.
You're 100% right. It goes again back to, we've got to prove what we're doing, and the way that we're doing that is we're sharing information. Now, these small rural practices, they can join in some group reporting with larger practices that have made EHR investments, that do have different reporting tools and can pull these metrics together more easily. But still, it's a constraint that they're burdened by, and increased regulation just naturally means more administrative heartache that we have to follow. But
I'm looking forward to seeing some of the similar statistics for 2018 when they're available, because basically what this seems to tell me is the people who were willing to try this in 2017 really came out largely unscathed. Only 5% with a negative payment adjustment at all, and 70+% getting positive payment adjustments and or bonuses. It kind of says, hey, the water's warm. It's not going. The downside risk is probably not enough of a deterrent for you to at least get in the routine and get accustomed to reporting these quality measures, because directionally, as you already mentioned, Alex, we're all going to be reporting quality metrics moving forward. So you're either going to be an early adopter, and I don't even know if now would be considered early, but it's either time to adopt, or eventually someone's going to be penalizing you for not adopting or for not reporting. And these organizations are getting practice. These rural and small practices that haven't done it before are getting accustomed to seeing their data. We're working with clients where they're starting to interpret, the data that they've either automatically reported through their EHRs or have been manually reporting. And so this learning process, it's kind of a safe zone based on these results, where as long as you're competent and have the systems to manage it, it's probably the right time to get involved if you haven't already.
Yeah, and I think we'll see. We've seen some higher scores out of the gate, and not the penalties or the level of bonuses we may have expected. But part of that was because We're trying to promote adoption, get clinicians into the program. And MIPS is a zero-sum game where, we're funding the bonuses by the level of penalties, dollars that we're taking in. And there were pathways to avoid those penalties in this first 2017 performance year that is turning into the 2019 payment year. Those protections will continue to be taken away. So back to your original comment, Brandt, is, it'll be very interesting to see what the 2018 outcomes look like once they become available. But we are not seeing, that maximum 4% achieved of upside potential that we initially thought we may see because of the protections and the easing into the program. But those will be slowly taken away, and so we'll see more and more movement towards the plus minus potential of in 2018 performance year what was 5%, in 2019 performance year what's going to be 7%.
Well, it'll be interesting to see because, all these programs have to remain budget neutral at the end of the day. So, this has been a get your feet wet type of journey, but at a certain point, you're right. I mean, the penalties are going to get steeper, and at some point, they're going to have to make sure the budget stays neutral.
Right. Well, let's kind of keep things moving and talk about, mechanisms they're doing that through, like the fee schedule changes.
Yeah, I'll just
pick this off here.
Yeah, we've tried to kind of hit the high points here of the changes. I think there's only 3,000 pages of information that we've boiled down here into bullet points. But we feel like these are some of the more salient ones, particularly for the groups that we're working with and some of the key takeaways we have. The fee schedule changes continue. There continues to be downward pressure on reimbursement. So even though there are increases, it's an indicator that reimbursement for fee-for-service is going to either plateau or be reduced ultimately as we continue forward, and that we're going to continue to see more of an emphasis on the value side of the equation and quality, as we just covered. There was a lot of consternation for 2019 about the proposed collapsing of the E&M codes for levels 2 through 4. Which was originally 2 through 5, and that's been delayed, which it was getting the most press, I think, for this round of revisions for CY19. But now I think it's gotten the attention, and this is not uncommon for CMS, as we've seen them do in the past, to send that flare and get everyone in a tizzy about it, and then pull back and say, okay, we'll give you more time to get prepared, but this is still coming. And that's kind of where we are with this. It's prompting organizations to say, we need to be more sophisticated and in tune with how our providers are documenting and why, and then how we're billing and reviewing those bills and then submitting those charges. So it's a coding question, it's a compliance question, it's a revenue cycle question, and ultimately it's a physician education and staff education and training issue. A lot of organizations, big and small, are not as dialed in as they want to be, and in many cases as they need to be, with that process, from the confidence and knowledge a provider has in the room with their coding and with their supporting documentation to start that process off in the way that is most rewarding financially for the organization, appropriately rewarding. So a couple of the next changes that we have listed here are directly related to that, provider documentation and scope of services and what they can provide. For the first time, CMS is now allowing providers to bill separately for virtual communication. So been a lot of news and press about telehealth, and there's been a varying degree of acceptance or adoption. There hasn't been a huge impetus to jump into telehealth for most standard, employee or independent medical group practices, but now there may be, as it's a potential increase in revenue and access and competitive advantage potentially in your market and how you see patients. And now that the reimbursement side is there, if you can get ahead of that curve, I think it's an opportunity for, in a world of decreasing margins, it's an opportunity for people to grow business without adding providers, locations, et cetera. And it's good patient care. So I think it's something that we view as a positive indicator of CMS adapting to treating and delivering care in the forum and the manner that patients want to be treated and want to receive that care. So,
Hey, and Brandt, just to jump in, I think that's such an important point that, this is a fee schedule change that providers are likely to appreciate, and that now CMS is taking steps to reward what could have been, or what was more so, uncompensated care in some degree by having some of these new telehealth G code CPTs rolled out through the fee schedule change.
Yep. The next bullet there is with regard to the documentation requirements, and this is something that I think it should have more of an impact than it will, because CMS is trying to reduce the administrative burden. That's the goal here. Providers are spending too much time worrying about writing down every little thing they've done or getting all the documentation entered again in this case. And so reducing that obligation for re-entering information that's already in there, even if it's not changed, they're acknowledging that we've got to do something to move docs away and providers away from spending their time writing and not seeing patients, essentially. And so this is supportive of the CMS direction to for patients over paperwork, and I think that's a solid indicator, but there's a lot of room to grow. And I think people and providers that we see are confused enough already about what they need to do from a documentation standpoint that the answer to this point has been, when in doubt, more is better. Try to get everything you can in there to make sure that things don't get rejected or that you're not called into question. And moving forward, if we're going to do this efficiently and have providers be as productive and provide the access that we need to provide for our patient populations, there has to be a change there. And so I think this is a positive step that, again, should be perceived positively by the provider community, as long as providers are willing, able, and proactive in adjusting for it. And that adjusting is sometimes harder than acknowledging the change in the first place.
Well, that's right. And if I could jump in a minute, what we're, because CMS made that change a voluntary policy for 2019, we're seeing on the provider audit side of things, clients really struggling with how to make this work. Number one, have organizations and practices really made a decision on how they're going to handle this potential change in documentation, not to mention the fact that there's, in the electronic record, workflow changes that need to happen to accommodate that documentation that you are relying on a previous entry from ancillary staff in some cases. So, if folks have not really thought about how they're going to implement this, if they do choose to proceed with the voluntary policy set out in the 2019 rule, they might want to kind of get their groups around this and start setting out a plan.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about that more here moving forward. The next section here is related to MIPS, and there were several adjustments made. Oh, sorry. Let's stay on there we go. Thank you. The adjustments to MIPS, I think, though small percentage-wise, do send a message, at least from where I sit, about the increasing influence of cost and efficiency as compared to just quality. And so it's always been a three-legged stool here, but this change in rates where we're increasing the weighting of the cost category for MIPS and slightly decreasing the weighting of the quality category, putting more of an emphasis on the EHR interoperability. We're saying, yes, you got to have high quality, but it also has to be efficiently delivered. And we can't keep spending as much on the quality for this to be sustainable moving forward. And I think that is echoed by some of the Pioneer ACO projects that we've seen either fail or pull out because there was not the return they were hoping for. And there are a lot of reasons that's gone the way it has. But generally, we've been very focused on quality and high quality and getting quality scores submitted. And that's a huge piece of it. And it continues to be MIPS. But we're acknowledging more and more that cost is a key component of our sustainability as an industry. And there's going to continue to be pressure on that side as we move down that scale we showed earlier towards the kind of total capitation and payment. So
absolutely.
Go ahead.
If I could just interject, I think that's just a good takeaway would be as we see these measure weightings take shape within MIPS, and the cost component is worth more, and that is likely to be the differentiator that for many groups. We haven't been measured on the cost that we're responsible for the cost of care to our patients before. Now we are. And in order to achieve that high performer bucket and get the highest score possible to maximize your return within MIPS, there's going to have to be a focus on cost as well as these other payment models that will continue to push that as well. But I just want to make that comment about the high performer bonus. This is probably going to be the differentiating point on whether you're able to, a group is able to achieve that in these upcoming few years.
Yep. Yeah. The final point there is related to the expanding eligibility. And so we've seen, as we've said already, these quality programs become more achievable or more broad-based with their provider audience. You don't have to be within a select few organizations to participate anymore. And after 2017 and now 2018, we're seeing them expand that again by reducing the hurdles and allowing providers that previously wouldn't have been eligible based on their low volume of Medicare patients or other reasons to now opt in and start reporting. And so the more we report, the more information we have, the more opportunity there is for driving down the costs from CMS's perspective, and also potentially rewarding providers for that work. Now, as Roz mentioned, it's budget neutral, so there are always going to be some winners and losers with this. And as that percentage continues to climb from 4 to 5 to 7% of plus minus opportunity, we're quickly going to be in a situation where the financials are much more meaningful, and those numbers and margins, especially if they expand beyond CMS, will start to have make or break type impact on the groups that are participating. So, I think all good messages being sent from CMS from where we sit, but it is going to require providers and groups to react and be more proactive. And at the end of the day, that's something I think we can all acknowledge, is that we have to change what we're doing at a fundamental level if we're ever going to change the outcomes down the line. And so the care delivery and the reduction in documentation requirements, I think, are going to be key pieces for provider happiness, which is a growing issue, and then also for the delivery of care and the ability to be financially successful at the end of the day. Let's go on to the next slide, where we put in a grid here the two new G codes that pertain to telehealth or remote evaluation and treatment. And there are several other new codes as well, but we thought this was a good example of the types and you can see kind of the impact here and the type of change that really presents an opportunity for practices. If you're already doing it, then there's now a more formal method for you to achieve increased reimbursement and provide service to patients in a way that maybe you haven't before. And if you're not, there's now really money on the table if you can operationalize this within your practice. And so a lot of groups, I think, don't need to necessarily set this up tomorrow, but there's now a carrot here for starting to meet patients where they want to be seen, and it also gives there could be strategic implications as you try to grow market share from a competitive advantage, and obviously financial if you can increase provider productivity and revenue, not only from these visits, but from the increased visit flow through the system, through your group as they come into through a virtual visit. So I think this will be an interesting, I really see this as an opportunity cost along with several of the other coding changes at this point. Let's go ahead and move on, Jess. So we talked about the communication technology and then kind of modernizing this patient-provider relationship. I think that'll continue to take root. And it's also going to demand, I think, that at some point provider groups start offering services to maintain being competitive. And so, again, being proactive here, I think, is a key takeaway for the providers listening. Is we can't continue to ignore this or to say that that's not going to reach me. It's here. There's reimbursement on the table now, as long as you can operationalize it, both with the delivery and then the billing and documentation of that delivery. There were several other E&M documentation guidelines that changed, and the reduction in requirements for providers, I think, is the most significant, and not re-entering the chief complaint or medical history when it's already in the chart, and all of those reductions being positive. There's also a reduction in requirements for the teaching physicians and not having to be documented by the provider if residents or other members have already documented. So, kind of recapping, we're acknowledging here that there is a change in need at the provider-patient relationship and at those contact points, and now systems are going to have to adjust their operation to take advantage of that. These are not required changes; these are opportunities for you to save time and increase reimbursement. Let's go ahead, Jeff. So what should you be doing now? There still are a lot of unknowns. We went through the 2017 outcomes, but on the whole, we think that presents directional opportunity. But for your practice, the big question is, do we jump into this? And if we do, what will it look like? And so we've been working with clients quite extensively on modeling this out. And we can model out anything from the MIPS participation to QVP to APMs, other value-based opportunities and contracts that people have in place. There's a big question for organizations that are very progressive in these areas and those that have yet to really jump in or participate in value-based reimbursement. There's a question about what the economic impact is to your practice. And so in a similar manner, we would suggest modeling for your own organization what happens with the coding, the E&M code compression. And so in 2021, how would that affect you today, and what could you be doing now to prepare for that from a service offering perspective, or in a lot of cases, I think just from a documentation perspective. And there's a significant amount of training and education, both for providers and staff here, that will be essential for groups to not just take advantage of the potential increases in revenue, but to not feel negative effects and impact of that as well. And so ignoring this is not the right strategy. And at the very least, even if you're not ready to sign up and participate, it's a good time to start investigating. Take a look at your own quality scores with those measures, and maybe even internally report so that you understand what's going on. coding audit and coding analysis is something we do on a regular basis that can really shed some light on who's doing well with this and who's struggling. And often you'll find that after the coding analysis, there are a lot of opportunities around documentation, and operationalizing any changes in documentation is an undertaking, whether it's a small group, independent practice, or integrated medical group. It just requires a lot of training. Providers have done what they do the way they do it for a reason, and some for a really long time. And there's angst and quite often just a lot of resistance to changing the way we do it. And we've been through a lot of that change in the last 10, 15 years with EHRs and documentation and utilization of templates and everything else that goes along with that. So I think simplifying it and making sure everyone's on the same page with the goals and ultimately the economic outcomes and the quality outcomes for patients and practices.
I'm going to jump in.
Yep, go ahead.
I'm going to just jump in one more time on those 2021 changes. I think the jury's still out, so to speak, on whether or not those will actually come to light at the end of this 3-year period based upon what other payers decide to do, et cetera. But again, CMS, in trying to reduce provider burden, has basically given providers 3 different choices on how they're going to handle the documentation in 2021. So again, I urge organizations and practices to come together and talk about, are you going to allow everybody to do whatever they want, or are you going to kind of standardize and formalize? And, from the auditing standpoint, I think what a nightmare to try to go in and do some audits on provider documentation and have, everybody taking a different approach. So it's really important to start talking about it now and trying to reach some standardization as we enter that 2021 period, again, if that comes to fruition.
Yeah, and we're still, as is common with CMS rollouts of any kind, we're still very much in the carrot phase where there's an opportunity here to do things better and to be on the front end and on the rewarding side of change. But ultimately, this is all headed towards be rewarded or be penalized. And so it's at the very least, it's time to be proactively prepared, even if it's not time to jump in yet. All right, why don't we transition over to some of the compliance implications here as related to all these other changes, Roz?
Sure. I wish I could say these were new compliance challenges, but the fact of the matter is we're still dealing with the same compliance challenges, but they remain really important for providers to pay attention to. But when I was preparing for this, I thought, if I'm going to come up with my top 3 compliance concerns for providers, I immediately went out to the OCR's website and re-reviewed some of the settlements that were published in 2018, and you'll see why in a minute. But here are 3 different ones. In February of 2018, we had Fresenius got hit with a $3.5 million settlement related to a breach, and through the investigation, what was discovered is that Fresenius had not conducted an accurate or thorough risk assessment. So they conducted one, but it was found to not be accurate or thorough enough. And then in October, we have Anthem, who enters into a $16 million settlement, quite a bit larger. And again, it's not that Anthem didn't do a security risk analysis. They didn't do it enterprise-wide. And so to me, that sends a message to our multi-entity systems or large group practices that have different sites, is your security risk analysis really has to cover your enterprise and be accurate and thorough. And then finally, in December, we had the hospitalist group, ACH, who settled to the tune of $500,000 because they actually had never performed a security risk analysis from 2005 until the 2014 investigation started. So obviously, these are OCR settlements, and they're based upon HIPAA breaches, but it's really relevant to our discussion today because, of course, HIPAA matters when it comes to MIPS and MACRA. Jess, you can go to the next slide. So why does HIPAA matter in MIPS? Well, because if you don't perform an adequate security risk analysis, you get a score of 0. And that obviously is going to affect your reward or risk in participating in the QPP. And what's interesting to me, every time I read those settlements and I see that there's a security risk analysis component to the penalty, I immediately always think, oh gosh, I wonder if they participated in MIPS this year, or I wonder if they attested that they had performed a security risk analysis. And so the message really is that the focus on the SRA has to be in the forefront for anybody participating in MIPS, and really looking at your process and making sure, obviously, that you're doing it, but that you are really looking at all of your assets that hold electronic PHI enterprise-wide and including that in your security risk assessment. Next slide. So timing is important also. I think most people know that the security risk analysis has to be performed every year, and it has to be performed and updated anytime you install any new software or equipment, or anytime you do an upgrade. So it's really kind of an ongoing process. And what's really important, and the message to providers here, is make sure you have a really solid remediation plan based upon your security risk analysis. And not only that you've identified what your risks are, but that you have a plan for working those risks and making improvements. And again, there's not a requirement that you fix absolutely everything that comes up on your list, but what they're going to be looking for is, did you perform it? Do you have a plan? And are you working that plan towards improvement and correcting security risk? Next slide. The second issue I think that's really important to talk about in compliance is the information blocking concept. Of course, HIPAA protects the right of patients to have access to their health information. But then we have this other law that was passed in 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act, which is leveraging some pretty high penalties for violations, up to $1 million per violation. And that law defines information blocking as the practice that's likely to interfere with, prevent, or materially discourage access, exchange, or use of electronic health information. There was an expectation that the ONC would have its final rule out by the end of 2018. And checking again today, there's still no final rule out there and no view that it's coming anytime soon. But we do expect it. And what I understand is that there's some difficulty trying to put some form around some of these terms and definitions so that it can at least be helpful guidance when it comes out. But so stay tuned for that. Next slide, Jess. Providers have to attest that they are not engaging in information blocking. And there's 3 specific statements that the providers have to attest to. And so we'll just go through these briefly. So the first one is that the provider did not knowingly or willfully take action to restrict the compatibility or interoperability of the certified electronic health record. And so knowing and willfully, I think that's pretty clear to most providers in terms of their behavior that may impact that. The second statement says that they're attesting that they've implemented technology, standards, policies, practices, and agreements reasonably calculated to ensure, to the greatest extent practicable, that their electronic health record was connected in accordance with the law, compliant with information exchange standards, implemented in a manner to permit timely access by patients or other providers, and really others, and implemented in a manner to permit bi-directional exchange with providers. And that second statement, CMS actually put some guidance out there to clarify a couple of things. And they said, we're not saying you providers have to have this specialized IT experience, not by any means. But they also said, quote unquote, to be clear, you should inform your IT developers, implementers, and others responsible for implementing and configuring your electronic health record of the requirements. And so by that guidance, CMS really seems to be telling providers that you've got an obligation to reach out to your IT software vendors and make sure that they know what's expected and that they're not doing anything in particular to restrict access. So, the recommendation under that particular standard, even though CMS doesn't require any documentation, but that you go ahead and seek reasonable assurances from your IT software vendor in writing and stick that in your, file related to MIPS. Excuse me. Finally, the third attestation that has to be made is that the provider responded in good faith and in a timely manner to patient and provider requests to retrieve, or exchange electronic health information. And again, acting in good faith, CMS reminds us in their guidance that means working with your developers to ensure that the technology is used correctly, that it's connected, that if there is a particular functionality within the software that permits this exchange, that you enable it. And so, again, the onus is on the providers. They don't have to be an IT expert, but they really do need to understand their software. They need to make sure that they are, doing software updates and patches regularly. And in those updates, if there's more interoperability applications or availability within them, that they're implementing them. So, and that's on that. But stay tuned to the ONC's final rule on information blocking, because I think it'll be interesting to see how they formulate any additional requirements.
Roz,
next slide, Jeff.
Do you mind if I ask a quick question?
Of course.
On the point about kind of validation and verification that these steps have been taken on behalf of the provider organization, do you foresee that potentially being something akin to what we have today with on the physician compensation side and dealing with Stark laws and things like that, as far as those regulatory standards, where there is going to be required to have outside documentation from a third party to truly validate that in the form of some sort of, if an official review or investigation came up? Do you think that's kind of the direction we're going?
With regard to information blocking, I'm not sure. CMS, again, doesn't require any documentation. It's kind of a defensive posture to take, which I do recommend, which is, formulating your discussion with your vendors in writing and having that in the file just to demonstrate in the event that you are audited or there's a complaint that there's been some information blocking on your end, that you have sought to comply with the information blocking rules. But to your point, on the security risk analysis side, the OCR has put out tools and guidance for practices in hospitals and health systems to perform their own security risk analyses. But it's onerous and it's long, and especially when you start talking about enterprise-wide and the number of assets that hold this EPHI in these various entities, it's overwhelming. And so a lot of providers and organizations do end up seeking out a third party to perform that, to document it.
Roz, what's the best way for, as these updates and changes occur from a compliance perspective, is there a single source of truth that you use or that others can use to just stay abreast, or what's your recommendation to even know when you need help with something?
Well, the best recommendation is to stay connected to the automatic updates that these various, the OCR sends out. You can sign up for their email list, read your professional journals, seek out guidance from your friends at COCR. No, but seriously, get involved with your national organizations. It's a continuous, in the compliance world, it's a continuous self-education journey because, across all these various laws, things are always changing. Right. So, okay, finally, and we'll close with this last slide. The third issue from a compliance standpoint is data validation. And, CMS does conduct random audits on MIPS-eligible clinicians every year. You've got a pretty quick turnaround to respond to CMS when they do. And they're going to require, if you do get selected for audit, that you give them primary source documents. So you'll want to, again, make sure you have everything documented and tucked away in an easy-to-access location. And again, if your audit turns up that you've submitted inaccurate documentation, of course that can result in recoupment as an overpayment to you. Like all things compliance, a 10-year record retention period is advisable. The other thing I'll say about data validation, what a lot of folks tell us they struggle with is making sure they have their documentation relevant to the measures in discrete fields in their electronic health record for ease of pulling. And for those organizations who don't have that or who struggle with that, it makes the whole data abstraction and submission and validation process even more difficult. And so, if you're not in an electronic record situation that has discrete fields to capture this data, take some extra time validating your data internally before you submit it.
Yeah, and I have to think, Roz, that going to kind of back to Brandt's question there, I think part of the compliance effort is trying to stay ahead of the curve as much as possible, and some of that goes in preparation on the front end. So you do have those records and that documentation in place so that if and when something does come up that you have to respond to, it's there. And then the other side of it is being flexible enough to adjust when it inevitably changes, whether it's, new rulings come out, new legislation, new policy, whatever that may be.
Right. I mean, exactly. It is a continuous effort to keep up with what's new in the news and, reading all of the guidance you can get on the fee schedule changes every year, among other laws that change all the time.
Well, excellent. This has been extremely helpful discussion, I believe. We did have one question, and we've got about 5 minutes left, so I think we should have time. But if there are any other questions, we want to make sure we get to those. So please, anyone listening, feel free to submit those. If there's any even questions after the webinar, we can respond to those offline, but we do want to respect everyone's time here. But and Roz, maybe I'll throw this out to you because I know you've actually talked about this a little bit, and then Brandt, Alex, feel free to jump in. But the question was, how can we educate providers on the fact that less documentation is okay under these new changes, when the emphasis has so much been in the past on over documentation to err on the side of caution? Roz, do you want to address that?
Sure, and that's an excellent question, and that's why I say I think the jury's still out on this whole concept of what may change in 2021. Number one, because there are some risk management concerns with reducing documentation. And I think, again, there's got to be some internal discussions about what's our expectation within our organization or our practice on how we're going to document to make sure that we don't omit something that's really important to document the care we gave a patient. But number two, CMS may have taken this approach for 2021 specifically, but the other payers still follow generally the 95-97 documentation guidelines for the most part. So it's really difficult to say, well, we're going to reduce documentation here, but you really end up not being able to do that unless you have all of the payers jumping on board and kind of standardizing the documentation guidelines that are acceptable to them. So I do think this is a really difficult topic, and fortunately they did delay implementation of those rules until 2021 because based upon comments from those stakeholders who responded, they recognize that there's a whole lot of work to do in order to get that going in 2021. So how do you educate providers? Right now, I think I would just start the discussion within your organizations on the approach you might take that involves, risk management, maybe your legal department and compliance, as well as the provider group and your coding staff as well, because the implications are really broad. And again, with CMS giving providers 3 different options for how they want to document, one is according to the current guidelines, one is by medical decision making, and one is by time. it's really inefficient and ineffective to have everybody doing something different within your organization. So I think there's a lot of internal education that has to happen before you just say, hey, do what you want and reduce your documentation.
Sure. Very, very helpful. Well, I think we're about to the end of our time here, and I do want to again thank everyone for participating and in this live webinar version of Coffee with Coker. We hope that everyone subscribes and listens to our regular Coffee with Coker podcast, which come out at least twice a month, oftentimes more than that, on a lot of topics, including other commentary on this topic and many other things. And I know we have one coming up shortly with Roz and on the topic of coding and some updates there. So please feel free to check that. You can always find us at coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find us at cokergroup.com. Everyone's contact information who participated today is available in the slides, and those slides will be made available to all the participants as well as coffeewithcoker.com. Again, thank you for participating, and we look forward to hearing from all of you in future episodes. We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them, and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. And we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.